Imagine a world where you could buy a washing machine, a dreamy prom dress, a shotgun, and even a literal house kit to build on your land, all from a single place. You didn't need an internet connection, you didn't need a smartphone, and you definitely didn't need a Prime subscription. You just needed the heavy thump of a £5 book hitting your front porch. While we obsess over the speed of online shopping today, the 1960s had something arguably more powerful and certainly more magical. Back then, Sears wasn't just a department store, it was the heartbeat of American culture. In 1965, this company was so dominant that it represented a staggering 1% of the entire US economy. If you walked into a typical home during the swinging 60s, practically everything inside, from the Kenmore appliances humming in the kitchen to the clothes on the kids' backs, came from that one catalog. They were the original everything store decades before Jeff Bezos ever packed his first box. But here is the strange part. This company had the logistics, the customer trust, and the absolute monopoly on convenience that modern tech giants would kill for. They had the world in the palm of their hand. So how did the undisputed king of the 1960s let the future slip through its fingers? To understand the collapse, we first have to step back into the golden age, where it all seemed too big to fail. To understand the sheer magnitude of the Sears phenomenon, you have to mentally transport yourself back to a crisp autumn afternoon in 1963. The internet does not exist. There are no algorithms predicting your next purchase, no targeted ads following you across social media, and certainly no drones dropping packages in your backyard. Instead, the entire universe of consumer desire was delivered by a mail carrier straining under the weight of a single massive object. The arrival of the Sears Fall-Winter catalogue wasn't just a delivery, it was a cultural event, a secular holiday that stopped households in their tracks from Maine to California. People called it the Big Book, and that nickname was not an exaggeration. We are talking about nearly 2,500 pages of thin, semi-glossy paper, weighing in at over 4 pounds, packed with over 100,000 individual items. It smelled of ink and possibility. For a child growing up in the 60s, this book was the portal to everything that mattered. If you were a kid in 1965, you didn't browse a website. You lay on the living room carpet, belly down with a red marker in your hand, circling the things that would define your existence. You'd flip past the endless pages of socket wrenches and heavy-duty workwear to get to the wish book section, the legendary toy department that felt like Willy Wonka had opened a warehouse. This was the era where G.I. Joe was born, where Barbie was transitioning from her 1959 debut into a 60s fashion icon with a bubble-cut hairstyle, and where slot car racing sets promised high-speed thrills right on your bedroom floor. But the magic wasn't just for the kids. For the parents, the catalogue was the blueprint for the American dream. In the 1960s, Sears was the curator of the middle-class aesthetic. This was the decade where the suburbs were exploding, and Sears was there to furnish every square inch of those new split-level ranch homes. If you needed a sofa, you didn't just buy a sofa, you bought a modern living suite in crushed velvet or the emerging earth tones that would come to define the late 60s. Harvest gold and avocado green. These weren't just products, they were symbols of having made it. The catalogue offered a curated vision of life that felt attainable. You could order a Silvertone electric guitar and amp for the teenager who just saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, sparking the garage band revolution across the country. You could order high-fidelity stereo systems to play the new rock and roll records. You could even order the very clothes on your back, which in the 60s meant a radical shift from the conservative cuts of the 50s to the bold patterns, polyester blends, and rising hemlines that mirrored the changing social landscape. Now pause for a second and think about the logistics required to pull this off without a single computer chip. This is where the comparison to Amazon becomes truly eerie. In the 1960s, Sears had mastered a system of distribution that was nothing short of a mechanical miracle. Their Chicago headquarters was a sprawling complex, a city within a city where orders arrived by the truckload, literally millions of paper envelopes containing handwritten order forms and personal checks. Inside these massive distribution centers, the operation was a symphony of analog efficiency. Merchandise was moved on miles of conveyor belts and chutes, directed by workers who had memorized codes and locations with encyclopedic precision. In some of their largest warehouses, employees famously wore roller skates just to traverse the concrete floors fast enough to pick orders. They utilized a complex system of pneumatic tubes, those clear pipes that suck canisters of air through a building, to shoot paperwork from one department to another in seconds. It was a physical internet, built of air pressure, gravity, and human sweat. If you enjoy diving into these forgotten empires and want to uncover more stories about how the past shaped our present, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us dig deeper into history to bring you these narratives. The brilliance of Sears in the 1960s was that they had successfully bridged the gap between the rural past and the suburban future. Originally, Sears Roebuck & Co. had built its empire by serving the isolated farmer, selling everything from cream separators to literal kits to build a house. By the 1960s, they had pivoted. They realized the farmer was moving to the suburbs, so they moved with him. They aggressively built physical retail stores to anchor the newly sprouting shopping malls that were beginning to dot the American landscape. They created a seamless ecosystem where you could browse the catalog at home, circle what you wanted, and then go down to Sears to see it in person or order it by phone. Another rising technology they leveraged perfectly. The trust they commanded was absolute. The slogan "Satisfaction Guaranteed or Your Money Back" wasn't just marketing fluff, it was a blood oath. In 1960s America, if a tool broke, you took it to Sears, and they handed you a new one, no questions asked. This built a level of brand loyalty that modern tech giants struggle to replicate. People didn't just shop at Sears, they relied on it. The Craftsman brand for tools and the Kenmore brand for appliances were seen as the gold standard of reliability. You bought a Kenmore washing machine in 1964, expecting it to last until 1984, and it usually did. This reputation for durability was the bedrock of their dominance. Furthermore, Sears was acting as a financial powerhouse. They introduced the concept of store credit on a massive scale. The Sears card was often the very first credit card a young couple would acquire. It allowed the booming baby boomer generation to furnish their homes now and pay later, fueling the consumerism that drove the 1960s economy. They weren't just selling the products, they were financing the lifestyle. By the mid-60s, Sears' revenue was so astronomical that it accounted for approximately 1% of the entire gross national product of the United States. To put that in perspective, imagine if a single store today sold one out of every $100 spent on everything in the entire country. That was Sears. But beneath this shiny, chrome-plated surface of success, the seeds of their future destruction were already being sown, even in their glory days. The 1960s was a decade of immense speed and change. While Sears was the master of the general store concept, the retail world was beginning to fracture. Discount stores like Kmart were opening up, challenging Sears on price. Specialty stores were emerging, challenging them on style. And perhaps most importantly, the very corporate structure that made Sears a titan, the massive bureaucracy, the internal competition between the catalog division and the retail store division, was beginning to calcify. They were becoming a giant, slow-moving ship in an ocean that was about to get very turbulent. Yet, standing in a Sears store in 1968, surrounded by the smell of roasting nuts from the candy counter and the hum of window air conditioners, you would never have guessed it. You were standing in the center of the world. They had the best supply chain, the most loyal customers, and the most famous catalog in history. They had everything. They were the Amazon of their time, but with a physical presence that made them untouchable. Or so they thought. Because as the 60s drew to a close, and the psychedelic haze of the decade gave way to the hard reality of the 70s, the world was about to shift under their feet, and the big book was about to face threats it was never designed to fight. The dominance of Sears in the 1960s went far beyond just selling physical goods. They were constructing a lifestyle ecosystem that was shockingly modern in its ambition, creating a walled garden of commerce that would make Apple or Google jealous today. When you walked into a Sears in 1965, you weren't just a shopper, you were a citizen of their corporate nation. You could buy your house from the catalog, fill it with Kenmore appliances, park a Sears-branded Allstate moped in the garage, and then walk over to the Allstate insurance booth right there in the store to insure all of it. They had seamlessly integrated financial services into retail decades before anyone coined the term fintech. The Allstate agents sat at little metal desks near the exit, often right next to the popcorn and roasted nut counter, so the smell of financial security was permanently intermingled with the scent of hot butter and salt. It was a masterstroke of cross-promotion. The catalog fed the stores fed the insurance arm, and the credit card fueled it all. However, this incredible machinery of dominance was hiding a complex and dangerous secret, a midpoint revelation that changes how we look at this history. While the world looked at Sears as a unified, unstoppable juggernaut, the reality inside the company was that of a bitter, silent civil war. By the mid-1960s, Sears was effectively two separate companies fighting for the same soul. On one side, you had the catalog division, the old guard, the heritage of the company that operated out of those massive, soot-stained brick warehouses in Chicago. On the other side, you had the retail store division, the shiny new princes of the suburban malls. In a modern company, these two arms would work together, sharing data and inventory. But in the 1960s, at Sears, they were practically enemies. The retail store managers were given immense autonomy, treating their locations like personal fiefdoms. A store manager in a booming suburb of Dallas or a rapidly expanding neighborhood in Long Island had the power to reject merchandise from the corporate buyers if they didn't like it. They often viewed the catalog not as a partner, but as a competitor that was stealing their sales. If a customer came in with a catalog trying to price match an item, the store manager might scoff at it. The pricing wasn't even consistent. You could find a drill in the big book for one price and see the exact same drill on the shelf for a different price, and the systems were so disconnected that nobody at headquarters could easily stop it. This internal friction was creating a massive inefficiency, right at the moment when efficiency was about to become the most important thing in retail. And this brings us to the great irony of 1962, a year that historians of retail now look back on as the year of the apocalypse for the old guard, though nobody at Sears realized it at the time. While Sears executives were toasting to record profits and planning their expansion into every corner of American life, three companies were founded in that single year that would eventually tear the retail landscape apart. In 1962, Sam Walton opened the first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas. That same year, the S.S. Kresge Company launched Kmart, and the Dayton Company launched Target. It was a perfect storm, a trifecta of disruption born in the same 12-month span. But here is the twist. Sears didn't care. In the boardroom of the 1960s, these new competitors were viewed as discounters, a dirty word in the Sears vocabulary. Sears prided itself on being a real department store. They sold quality. They sold the good, better, best pricing strategy. They believed that the American middle class, flush with cash from the post-war economic boom, would never stoop to shopping at these chaotic, fluorescent-lit discount barns that sold cheap plastic goods. Sears was competing with J.C. Penney and Montgomery Ward. They were looking sideways at their peers, completely ignoring the predators nipping at their heels. They were so blinded by their own prestige that they failed to see that the definition of value was shifting. Kmart in particular exploded in the 1960s, growing at a pace that should have terrified Sears. Kmart was capturing the lower end of the market, the very people who used to rely on the Sears catalog for basics. But Sears executives sat in their high-rise offices, convinced that their brand loyalty was invincible. This hubris was compounded by the cultural shift of the late 1960s. As the decade wore on, the pristine, disciplined image of the 1950s began to crack. The country was entering the era of Woodstock, the Vietnam War protests, and a radical rethinking of consumerism. Sears, with its rigid corporate hierarchy and conservative aesthetic, began to look like the establishment. They struggled to pivot. When the peacock revolution in men's fashion hit, bringing bright colors, wide ties, and Nehru jackets, Sears tried to adapt, but it often felt like a dad trying too hard to be cool. The catalog pages from the late 60s show this awkward transition. Stiff models with crew cuts uncomfortably wearing psychedelic shirts. They were chasing a youth culture that inherently distrusted big corporations, and for the first time, Sears didn't have its finger on the pulse of the generation. Yet despite the internal war, the rising competition, and the cultural disconnect, the cash kept rolling in. The momentum of the brand was so strong that it masked all these structural rots. It was like a massive ocean liner with the engines cut. It was still moving forward with immense speed, just from inertia. And in a display of ultimate confidence, or perhaps the ultimate symbol of a peak before the fall, Sears decided to cement its legacy in the most physical way possible. In the late 1960s, amidst this swirling chaos of competition and internal strife, Sears' leadership made a decision that would define the Chicago skyline and their own ego. They decided to consolidate their thousands of scattered office employees into one building. But not just any building. They announced plans to build the tallest building in the world, the Sears Tower. It was to be a monument to their commercial empire, a black aluminum and glass monolith that would pierce the clouds, looking down on every other company on Earth. This project, conceived at the height of their power, serves as the perfect metaphor for the Sears of the 1960s. They were building a fortress in the sky at the exact moment the ground war was changing forever. They were investing in vertical dominance, bureaucracy, hierarchy, prestige, while Sam Walton and the founders of Kmart were investing in horizontal dominance, logistics, speed, and low prices. As the architects drew up the blueprints for the 110-story tower, they were designing a tombstone for an era. The sheer cost and focus required to build this skyscraper distracted leadership at a critical juncture. Instead of reinventing their catalog for a faster world or unifying their fractured internal divisions, they were obsessing over office space and elevator schematics. By the time the calendar flipped to 1969, Sears was a paradox. To the outside observer, it was the strongest company in America, the Amazon of its day, holding the keys to the consumer kingdom. But on the inside, the everything store was becoming the everything problem. The catalog was fighting the stores, the prices were uncompetitive against the rising discounters, and the leadership was literally building an ivory tower to isolate themselves from the reality on the street. The 1960s had been their golden age, but they had spent the decade eating their own seed corn, assuming the harvest would last forever. As they looked out from their future offices in the clouds, they couldn't see that the customers down below were starting to drive their station wagons into the parking lots of Kmart and Walmart, leaving the big book unopened on the coffee table. The sheer inertia of the Sears empire in the late 1960s was something to behold, a spectacle of commercial gravity that seemed to bend the laws of economics around it. As the decade careened toward its chaotic conclusion, the Sears catalog had evolved into a masterpiece of print engineering, a testament to the company's absolute refusal to do anything by half measures. By 1968, producing the Big Book was one of the largest industrial printing operations on the planet, rivaling the output of major government mints. They weren't just printing a list of products, they were printing the dreams of a nation in high-fidelity color. The transition to color photography in the catalog was a defining shift of the 60s, mirroring the explosion of Technicolor in cinemas and the arrival of color television sets in living rooms, sets that Sears, of course, sold by the thousands under their Silvertone brand. To flip through a 1969 Sears catalog is to see a company at the absolute zenith of its confidence. The pages were dense with the artifacts of a changing society. There were fondue sets for the sophisticated suburban dinner party, electric typewriters for the aspiring student, and bold psychedelic bedspreads that tried to capture the flower power aesthetic for the middle American bedroom. But this massive production process was becoming a golden cage. The lead time required to create the catalog was immense. Buyers had to commit to products and prices months, sometimes nearly a year in advance. In the stable, predictable economy of the 1950s, this was a manageable risk. But the late 1960s were anything but stable. Inflation was beginning to creep up, a silent predator that would devour the 1970s, but its teeth were already visible in 68 and 69. Imagine the vulnerability of printing millions of books with fixed prices in an economy where the cost of raw materials, steel for the washing machines, cotton for the shirts, was starting to fluctuate wildly. Once that price was printed in ink and dropped on a porch in Iowa, it was gospel. If the cost of manufacturing went up, Sears ate the loss. The catalog, once their greatest strength, was slowly turning into a heavy anchor, dragging behind a ship that needed to maneuver through increasingly choppy waters. While Kmart could change the price of a toaster with a sticker gun in 10 seconds, Sears was locked into a promise made 6 months ago. This rigidity was the first subtle tremor of the earthquake to come. Furthermore, the 1960s marked the dawn of the computer age in corporate America, a moment that should have been Sears' coronation as the eternal king of retail. They were one of the first major corporations to invest heavily in the new IBM mainframe computers, the massive, humming room-sized brains that promised to revolutionize business. In theory, Sears had everything needed to become Amazon 30 years before Amazon. They had the customer data. They knew that Mrs. Smith in Ohio bought a crib in 1962, which meant she would likely need a bicycle in 1968 and a prom dress in 1978. They possessed a database of human behavior that was unrivaled in the history of commerce. But here is the tragedy of the Sears story. They used this futuristic technology to pave cow paths. Instead of using these powerful IBM System 360s to revolutionize their logistics, predict trends, or unify the inventory between their warring catalog and retail divisions, they used them primarily for accounting and billing. They used the most powerful machines on earth to count their money faster, rather than to figure out how to make more of it. The data remained siloed. The catalog division guarded their customer lists like nuclear secrets, refusing to share the insights with the retail stores, fearing that the stores would steal their customers. It was a failure of imagination so profound that it is hard to comprehend in retrospect. They had the algorithm in their filing cabinets, but they lacked the vision to digitize it. As the decade closed, another threat emerged from the cultural ether, one that Sears was uniquely ill-equipped to handle: the death of the generalist. The 1960s had been the era of the general store, the one-stop shop. But as the baby boomers grew up, their tastes fractured. They didn't want to buy their bell-bottom jeans at the same place their dad bought his lawnmower. They wanted cool. They wanted niche. In 1969, a small store called The Gap opened in San Francisco, selling only Levi's records and tapes. It was cool, focused, and spoke the language of the youth. The Limited had opened in 1963, focusing solely on women's fashion. These category killers began to nip at the edges of the Sears empire. Sears was trying to be everything to everyone, selling shotguns, bras, tires, and insurance under one roof. In doing so, they started to become nothing to anyone in particular. To the cool teenager of 1969, Sears was the place your parents dragged you to. It was becoming uncool at the exact moment when cool became the most valuable currency in the American economy. The disconnect was palpable in the layout of the stores themselves. By the late 60s, a Sears store was a chaotic mix of smells and sounds that didn't quite make sense anymore. You had the smell of rubber tires from the auto center wafting into the women's fashion department. You had the loud clatter of the key-cutting machine competing with the demo of a stereo system, playing the sanitized versions of rock hits. It was a utilitarian experience in an era that was moving toward experience-based retail. And yet, the executives in Chicago were blinded by the raw numbers. Revenue was still climbing. The Sears Tower was rising floor by floor, a steel manifestation of their ego. They looked at the charts and saw a line going up, mistaking momentum for health. They failed to see that they were winning a game that was about to end. The rules of retail were being rewritten by Sam Walton's logistics obsession and the agile specialty stores. Sears was still playing by the rules of 1955. They were doubling down on their own bureaucracy. The management structure at Sears in the late 60s was so bloated that it became the stuff of legend. There were layers upon layers of middle management, committees to decide on committees, and a culture of consensus that strangled innovation. If a buyer wanted to introduce a radical new product, it had to pass through a gauntlet of approvals that could take a year. Meanwhile, a trend could be born, peak, and die in London or New York within 6 months. Sears was an elephant trying to dance with gazelles. As 1969 turned into 1970, the stage was set for a slow-motion tragedy. The Sears catalogue, that £4 miracle of the 1960s, was still the Bible of the American consumer. But the congregation was starting to lose faith. The wish book was still heavy, but the wishes were changing. The company had built the tallest building in the world to look down on their kingdom, but they had forgotten to look at the ground, where the foundation was beginning to crack. They had the logistics, the brand, and the money to rule the next century, but they were about to make a series of decisions that would turn them from the Amazon of the 20th century into a cautionary tale of the 21st. The fall wouldn't happen overnight. Giants don't trip, they crumble. But the first stone had already fallen, and nobody in the executive suite heard the sound. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the Sears Roebuck Company stood atop a summit that no other retailer in history had ever reached, gazing out at a landscape they believed they owned in perpetuity. The physical manifestation of this supreme confidence was rising, steel beam by steel beam in the heart of Chicago. The Sears Tower, conceived in the heady days of the late 60s, was not merely an office building, it was a declaration of immortality. It was designed to house the thousands of employees needed to run this empire, a vertical city, for a company that had become a nation unto itself. But in a twist of irony that would make a Greek tragedian weep, the completion of this black aluminum monolith marked the exact moment the company began its slow, agonizing descent. They had built the tallest tombstone in the world, a monument to a business model that was already dying, even if the pulse was still beating strongly in the revenue charts. The tragedy of Sears is not that they were defeated by a smarter enemy, but that they held the winning lottery ticket for the 21st century in their hands back in 1969 and threw it away. When we call Sears the Amazon of the 1960s, it is not a loose metaphor. It is a literal description of their operational capacity. By the end of the decade, Sears had perfected the art of long-tail retail. They had massive regional distribution centers that could ship a singular item to a rural doorstep within days. They had a proprietary credit system that processed millions of transactions, giving them data on consumer habits that was more valuable than gold. They had Amazon Basics before Jeff Bezos was born, in the form of Kenmore and Craftsman, private label brands that were trusted more than the national competitors. They even had the website in the form of the catalog, a browsing interface that lived in the customer's home, available 24/7, requiring no electricity and no login. However, the fatal flaw codified in the 1960s was a matter of identity. The executives in the boardroom, surrounded by the haze of cigarette smoke and the confidence of the post-war boom, fell in love with the wrong part of their business. They became obsessed with the physical store. The 1960s was the decade of the shopping mall, and Sears decided to become the anchor of every mall in America. They poured billions of dollars into real estate, into brick and mortar, into the heavy, immovable infrastructure of retail. They viewed the catalog, their most innovative, futuristic asset, as a quaint relic of their rural past, a heritage division that was secondary to the glitz and glamour of the department store. They treated the catalog as a marketing tool to get people into the stores, rather than realizing that the catalog was the store of the future. Imagine if, in 1969, Sears had leaned into the catalog instead of the mall. Imagine if they had used those IBM mainframes to optimize direct-to-consumer shipping, rather than just counting inventory. When the internet arrived decades later, Sears would have been the only company on Earth positioned to flip the switch. They wouldn't have needed to build warehouses, they already had them. They wouldn't have needed to build customer trust. They owned it. They wouldn't have needed to figure out logistics. They invented them. Amazon would have been a footnote, or perhaps just a software provider for the Sears empire. But because of the culture established in the 1960s, a culture of internal competition where the retail managers sabotaged the catalog managers, they paralyzed themselves. They chose the past over the future because the past was profitable and the future was uncertain. The emotional toll of this collapse is tied directly to what the catalog represented to the American family of the 1960s. The Wish Book was more than a sales brochure. It was a testament to a specific kind of American optimism. It appeared in mailboxes during a time of immense cultural upheaval, The assassinations of JFK and MLK, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and it offered a sense of stability and normalcy. It promised that no matter how chaotic the world was outside, you could still order a warm flannel shirt, a sturdy set of wrenches, or a beautiful dollhouse, and it would arrive, guaranteed. It was a tangible connection to the good life that was promised to the middle class. When Sears began to falter, losing its way in a maze of corporate bureaucracy and losing its quality to cost-cutting measures, it felt like a betrayal of that social contract. The 1960s were the peak, but they were also the poison. The sheer size of the company in that decade made it arrogant. They ignored the discount revolution started by Walmart and Kmart in 1962 because they believed they were above it. They ignored the niche revolution of the late 60s because they believed they were the everything store. They believed the customer would always come to them out of habit. But the consumer of the late 60s was changing. They were becoming less loyal, more price-conscious, and more individualistic. Sears continued to market to a homogeneous middle American that was rapidly fracturing into 1,000 different subcultures. By the time they realized their mistake, the cement was dry. The massive Sears Tower was finished, locking them into a corporate structure that couldn't pivot, couldn't dance, and couldn't survive the digital storm on the horizon. Today, the Sears catalog is a collector's item, a heavy paper ghost haunting the shelves of antique stores. It serves as a reminder that no empire is too big to fail, and that the seeds of destruction are often sown during the harvest of greatest success. The Amazon of the 60s didn't die because the internet killed it. It died because it refused to see that it was the internet, long before the technology existed to prove it. They had the world in their hands in 1969, and they let it slip through their fingers, page by glossy page. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise and fall of a retail giant and want to ensure you don't miss our next story about the hidden history of the 20th century, please make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. We have many more stories like this coming, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one.